The night did not breathe. It suffocated. Outside the reinforced windows of the black Cadillac Escalade, New York City was disappearing under a shroud of wet gray sleet. This wasn't the picturesque snow of a postcard. It was the heavy industrial slush of Queens, thick with salt and the filth of 8 million lives. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavy enough to crush a weaker man's lungs. Salvator Rizzo sat in the rear passenger seat, his silhouette cutting a jagged predatory line against the crimson glow of the dashboard. He was a man of sharp edges and expensive wool, draped in a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than the average American's annual mortgage. But the elegance was a lie, or rather, a lacquer. Beneath the silk-lined lapels was a body honed by decades of paranoia and the kind of violence that doesn't make the evening news, because the people who witness it don't live long enough to call the tip line. He didn't look at the window. He didn't look at the crumbling tenement building to his left, where the brick was stained with the soot of 100 winters. He looked at the digital clock on the dash. 11:48 p.m. The rhythmic, hypnotic thump-thump of the windshield wipers was the only heartbeat in the car. It was a mechanical, soulless sound, dragging a smear of gray ice across the glass over and over again. Thump, thump. The smell inside the car was a sensory paradox. It was the scent of the pinnacle and the gutter. The rich, buttery aroma of hand-stitched Italian leather seats fought against the acrid, lingering ghost of a Turkish cigarette Salvatore had finished 10 minutes ago. It was the smell of a man who belonged in a penthouse, but was currently idling in a war zone. In the driver's seat, Rocco sat like a gargoyle carved from granite. A jagged, ropey scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jawline, a souvenir from a night in Bensonhurst that had gone sideways in 1988. Rocco didn't breathe. He cycled air. His right hand, thick-fingered and calloused, didn't rest on the steering wheel. It rested on the cold, cross-hatched grip of a chrome-plated .45, tucked just beside the center console. Rocco's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He didn't see a boss. He saw a man possessed. Boss. Rocco's voice was a low growl, like gravel spinning in a drum. The Moretti crew. They're thick as thieves 2 blocks over on northern BLVD. They saw us peel off from the gala. They aren't stupid. They know we're out of position. Salvatore didn't blink. He watched the clock. 11:49 p.m. Let them watch, Salvatore said. His voice was a silken blade, smooth, quiet, and terrifyingly sharp. It carried the weight of a man who had never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. Moretti is a scavenger. He waits for the lion to sleep, but I am very much awake, Rocco. Before the story pulls you under, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and tap subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. A police siren wailed 3 blocks over, a lonely Doppler effect scream that rose and fell through the frozen air. In this neighborhood, a siren didn't mean help. It meant a body had finally been found, or a drug deal had reached its inevitable bloody conclusion. Salvatore reached up, his fingers steady as he adjusted the silk bow tie at his throat. He wasn't looking at the clock anymore. He was looking at a single dimly lit window on the 4th floor of the tenement. Behind that window, a thin yellow light flickered, the glow of a television playing a movie he knew she had seen a dozen times. He could envision her there. Elena Morrison. The woman who knew the exact temperature he liked his espresso and the exact moment he was about to lose his temper in a deposition. The woman who kept his secrets behind a pair of sensible glasses and a wall of professional silence. She was his secretary, his shadow. And tonight, she was the only person in a city of millions who didn't want a piece of his soul. Rocco, Salvatore whispered. Yeah, boss? The engine stays running. If I am not back down these stairs by 12:05 a.m., if the ball drops and I haven't cleared that front door. Salvatore paused, a ghost of a predatory smile touching his lips. You call the boys at the docks. You tell them the truce is over. You burn the gala to the ground, leave nothing but ash and tuxedo buttons. Rocco's grip tightened on the .45. And the girl? Salvatore's eyes went cold, a flat, dead obsidian. If anyone touches a hair on her head, I will dismantle this borough brick by brick until I find the man responsible, and then I will show him what noir really means. Salvator reached for the door handle. The metal was freezing, a biting reminder of the world outside the leather-scented vacuum. He pushed the door open, and the roar of the New York winter rushed in. The sleet hit him instantly, 1,000 tiny needles of ice against his skin. He stepped out, his handmade Italian loafers, shoes designed for marble floors and red carpets, sinking deep into the gray, salty slush of the gutter. He didn't flinch as the brine ruined the leather. He didn't shudder as the wind whipped his coat open, threatening to steal the heat from his bones. He stood on the sidewalk, a king in the middle of a graveyard. He looked up at the fourth-floor window. Why was he here? Why was the man who controlled the flow of every illegal scent from Montauk to Manhattan standing in the freezing rain for a girl who talked to a succulent and wore penguin pajamas? He began to walk toward the door. Each step was a defiance of the rules he had spent 20 years building. He was breaking the code. He was crossing the line between the throne and the person who sat beside it. Inside the car, Rocco watched his boss disappear into the dark maw of the building's entryway. He looked at the clock. 11:50 p.m. 10 minutes until the world turned over. 10 minutes until the new year began. Rocco pulled the .45 from its hiding place and racked the slide. The sound, a sharp, metallic clack-slick, was the loudest thing in the night. Before we reveal why the king of the city left his throne for a walk-up in Queens, like this video if you believe loyalty is the only law that matters. Let's see how many of you respect the code of silence. To understand the man standing in the slush of a Queens gutter, one must understand the city that forged him. This was not the sanitized glass and steel New York of the modern era. This was the mid-1990s, a city caught in a violent, shivering transition. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors and the metallic tang of blood and ozone rising from the subway grates. Above ground, the city was being scrubbed clean by the iron fist of the Giuliani administration, a broken windows policy that aimed to sweep the grime from the streets. But beneath that fresh coat of paint, the old world, the world of the families, the codes, and the quiet executions, was rotting from the inside out. The New York winter of '94 didn't just bring cold, it brought a predatory silence. The racial tensions of the previous decade still simmered like a low-grade fever in neighborhoods like Howard Beach and Crown Heights. The economy was a jagged heartbeat, creating a cavernous divide between the gilded ceilings of the Wall Street elite and the crumbling tenements of the outer boroughs. It was into this fracture that Salvator Rizzo stepped, not as a king, but as a surgeon. In the late 1980s, the Five Boroughs were a slaughterhouse. The old dons had grown fat and sloppy, and the streets were running red with the results of a dozen disorganized power vacuums. Salvator Rizzo had changed all that. He wasn't a button man who enjoyed the wet work. He was a logistical genius who understood that a bullet was a failure of negotiation. He had stabilized the city. He had brokered the peace between the warring Italian factions and the rising, hungry crews from the housing projects. He was the man who made sure the garbage was picked up, the construction sites stayed open, and the silence stayed absolute. To the public, he was a venture capitalist with a penchant for high-end real estate. To the underworld, he was a force of nature. While Salvatore moved through a world of mahogany boardrooms and smoke-filled backrooms, Elena Morrison moved through a world of beige. Elena was a creature of the margins. Her history was a series of sterile rooms and social workers who couldn't remember her name. Her parents had been taken by a rain-slicked highway when she was 8, leaving her to navigate the labyrinth of the New York foster care system. She had learned early that to be invisible was to be safe. She had worked 2 jobs to put herself through a local college, surviving on lukewarm coffee and the kind of grit that doesn't roar, it just persists. For 2 years, she had been the gatekeeper to the Rizzo empire. She sat in a high-backed ergonomic chair in an office that smelled of expensive cologne and old money, illuminated by the humming, flickering glare of fluorescent lights. She was the one who made the world move for a man who didn't seem to have a heart. She lived in a 4th-floor walk-up in Astoria, a place where the walls were thin enough to hear her neighbors' nightly arguments about the price of milk. Her only companion was Steve, a succulent that occupied a cracked ceramic pot on her windowsill. Steve was a testament to ugly survival. He was brown at the edges, leaning precariously toward the gray light of the window, refusing to die but refusing to thrive. "At least you don't need much," she would whisper to the plant as she ate a bowl of cereal for dinner. Steve never answered. He just existed, a mirror of her own quiet, isolated life. The true nature of their dynamic was best seen on a Tuesday in mid-November, 6 weeks before the new year. The boardroom. On the 44th floor of the Rizzo building was a cathedral of glass and shadow. Salvator sat at the head of a table carved from a single piece of dark walnut. Across from him sat Vinny the Vulture Moretti, a man who dressed like a gentleman but thought like a hyena. Moretti was pushing for a larger cut of the waste management contracts in New Jersey, his voice rising, his hands gesturing wildly, spittle flying from his lips. "It's about respect, Sal. My boys are doing the heavy lifting. We deserve a bigger piece of the pie," Moretti shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. Salvator didn't move. He didn't even look up from the document in front of him. He looked like a statue carved from midnight. Elena stood in the corner, a notepad in her hand, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She looked like a ghost, invisible to the men in the room, but she was the only one watching Salvator's hands. She saw the way his left thumb traced a rhythmic, almost imperceptible circle against the wood of the chair. It was a tell. It was the only sign of his exhaustion, his utter boredom with the theater of violence. "Vinny," Salvator finally spoke. The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the ventilation system. "You speak of lifting, but your books speak of leaking. You lost $42,000 in shrinkage last month at the Newark site. You didn't lose it to the cops. You lost it to your own greed." Salvator slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a breakdown of every cent Moretti had tried to skim. "I don't pay for respect, Vinny. I pay for results. And right now, your results are worth exactly nothing." Moretti blanched. He looked at the paper, then at Salvator, his bravado evaporating like mist. "Sal, I can explain." "Don't," Salvator interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. "Go back to Jersey. Fix the leak. If I see your face in this boardroom before the books are balanced, you won't be worried about your cut of the pie. You'll be worried about the weight of the Hudson." Moretti scrambled out of the room, his tough guys trailing behind him like whipped dogs. As the heavy doors clicked shut, the silence returned. Salvator finally leaned back, closing his eyes. The mask of the Mafia King slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a man who was profoundly, deeply tired of the game. He didn't look at the door. He looked at the corner. "Elena," he murmured. "Yes, Mr. Rizzo." "Cancel the 4 p.m. Tell them I've had enough of children for one day." "Of course," she said, her voice a steady, calming anchor in the room. "I'll order you an espresso, double shot, no sugar." Salvator looked at her then, really looked at her. For a moment, the distance between the king and the secretary vanished. He saw the girl who had spent her life in the shadows, and she saw the man who was trapped in a palace of his own making. "Thank you, Elena," he said softly. She nodded once, adjusted her glasses, and stepped back into the beige light of the outer office. She was invisible again, but as she walked away, she felt the heat of his gaze against her back, a physical sensation that lingered longer than the smell of his expensive cigars. The underworld of New York was a delicate ecosystem, and in 1994, the air was growing thin. While Salvator Rizzo sat at the apex, he was surrounded by men who mistook his stoicism for stagnation. Chief among these was Vinny the Vulture Moretti. Moretti was a man built of sharp angles and cheap ambition. He lacked Salvator's generational patience. To Moretti, the New York Code wasn't a philosophy. It was a hurdle. He spent his nights in smoke-filled social clubs in Howard Beach, whispering into the ears of younger, hungrier soldiers that Salvator had gone corporate. He pointed to the glass tower, the lack of public executions, and, most dangerously, the quiet, unassuming woman who sat outside Salvator's office. In the twisted psychology of the man like Moretti, an obsession with a woman wasn't a romance. It was a structural weakness. He viewed Elena Morrison as the chink in the armor, a soft spot where a blade could be inserted to topple the king. The tension reached a boiling point 10 days before Christmas. The office was decorated with a forced, sterile cheer, a large pine tree in the lobby adorned with blue and silver bulbs that felt as cold as the glass walls. Elena was walking back from the break room carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. She was focused on the liquid, careful not to spill a drop on the white marble floors. She didn't see Moretti and his 2 shadows, Polly and Big Mike, rounded the corner of the executive suite. Moretti didn't move out of the way. He stepped into her path, his shoulder catching hers with the force of a linebacker. The cups flew. The plastic lids popped off like champagne corks. Hot, dark liquid splashed across the front of Elena's gray wool skirt and onto Moretti's hand-stitched silk tie. "Jesus, watch where you're going, sweetheart," Moretti barked, his voice echoing off the glass partitions. He didn't look at his tie. He looked at Elena, his eyes gleaming with a predatory malice. "You're making a mess of my suit. Do you have any idea what this costs? Or do you only know the price of the pencils you sharpen?" Elena froze, her face turning a deep, mortified crimson. I'm so sorry, Mr. Moretti. I didn't see you. Let me get some napkins." "Napkins?" Moretti stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could smell the peppermint he used to mask the scent of cheap gin. "You think a napkin fixes a $2,000 tie? Maybe you should be more careful. Maybe you're getting too comfortable in this office, thinking you're more than just a piece of the scenery." He reached out, his hand moving as if to grab her chin, to demean her further, when a sound cut through the air. It wasn't a shout, it was the click of a door. Salvator stood in the doorway of his office. He wasn't wearing his jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and the ghost of a faded tattoo from his youth. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Polly and Big Mike instinctively took a half step back, their eyes darting to the floor. Salvator walked toward them. His gait was slow, deliberate, the walk of a man who owned the air everyone else was breathing. He stopped 6 inches from Moretti. He didn't look at the coffee on the floor. He didn't look at Moretti's tie. He looked directly into Moretti's eyes. The silence lasted for a full 30 seconds. It was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made Moretti's pulse visible in the vein of his neck. "Vinny," Salvatore said. His voice was a low, vibrating hum. "You're bleeding." Moretti blinked, confused. "What? No, it's just coffee, Sal—" "No," Salvatore interrupted, his eyes never wavering. "You're bleeding. You just haven't felt it yet." Salvatore reached out, his hand moving with the speed of a striking cobra. He didn't strike Moretti. He simply plucked the stained silk tie from Moretti's chest and gave it a sharp, violent tug, pulling Moretti's face inches from his own. "This hallway is mine," Salvatore whispered, the words intended only for Moretti's ears. "This woman is mine. If you ever breathe in her direction again, if you even think her name in your sleep, I will make sure the last thing you see is the bottom of a hole you dug yourself. Do we understand each other?" Moretti's bravado shattered. He looked like a man who had stared into the sun and realized he was blind. "Yeah, Sal, yeah, we're good. Just a mistake." Salvatore released the tie, smoothing it out with a mocking tenderness. "Go, get a new tie, and tell the commission I'll call them when I have something worth saying." Moretti and his men scrambled for the elevators, their shoes squeaking on the marble. Salvatore turned to Elena. The terrifying heat in his eyes vanished, replaced by something soft, something almost aching. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean white linen handkerchief. "Go to my office, Elena," he said, his voice now gentle. "The coffee is just a stain. Don't let them see you shake. I'll have my tailor send over a new skirt by lunch." "I can clean it, Mr. Rizzo," she whispered, her hands still trembling. "Elena," he said, stepping closer, blocking her from the view of the rest of the office, "you aren't the scenery. Never think that." As the year wound down, the omens grew darker. Salvatore's desk was cluttered with missed calls from the commission, the heads of the 5 families who governed the city. They were demanding a meeting. They wanted to discuss the future. In the language of the mob, that meant they were preparing for a transition. The whispers on the street were that the Italian mob was losing its grip to the Russian syndicates and the street gangs, and the commission blamed Salvatore's passive leadership. They saw his refusal to engage in a turf war as a sign of weakness. The New Year wasn't just a holiday, it was a deadline. Moretti had been seen meeting with the heads of the Genovese family in a basement in Little Italy. Money was changing hands. The code of silence was being traded for the code of the highest bidder. Salvator knew. He saw the cracks. He felt the shift in the air. He knew that by the time the ball dropped in Times Square, a coup would be in motion, and he knew that the first move they would make wouldn't be against his life. It would be against his heart. As the calendar bled out its final days of December, the atmosphere in the Rizzo building shifted from professional to predatory. The air didn't feel cold, it felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the hallways to make room for the secrets being whispered behind closed doors. Salvator became a ghost within his own empire. He didn't pace. He sat for hours in his high-backed chair, staring at the panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, his hands perfectly still. He was calculating the trajectory of every threat, every missed call from the commission, and every smirk from Vinnie Moretti. But mostly, he was thinking about the girl in the beige office. December 31st arrived with the weight of a funeral shroud. Elena left the office early. She walked through the slush of Astoria, her head down, her breath hitching in the biting wind. To the world, she was just another commuter. To herself, she was an island. Inside her apartment, the silence was a physical presence. She didn't turn on the lights immediately. She stood in the doorway, listening to the rhythmic, violent clanking of the steam radiator, a sound like iron teeth gnashing in the dark. It was a lonely, mechanical sound that underscored the emptiness of the four walls. She shed her professional skin, the gray, wool skirt, the starched white blouse, and reached for her armor. The penguin pajamas were thick, oversized, and ridiculous. They were a Christmas gift she had bought herself, wrapped in brown paper, and opened in silence. They were a soft, fleece-lined shield against a world that expected her to be a secretary, a daughter, or a friend, roles she didn't know how to play. She sat on the sofa, her legs tucked under her. On the coffee table sat a bottle of wine. She'd spent $40 on it, a fortune for her, but the first sip tasted like copper and old wood. It was mediocre, a hollow promise of luxury that didn't deliver. Across the room, the TV hummed to life. The blue light of the screen washed over her, reflecting off the tears she didn't realize were falling. On the screen, two actors chased each other through an airport, their dialogue sharp, witty, and entirely foreign to her life. She wasn't crying because of the movie. She was crying because she was 29, and the only living thing that knew her name was a succulent named Steve, who was slowly dying on her windowsill. At 9 p.m., the silence was broken by the sharp electric buzz of her phone. Her heart didn't beat. It lunged. S. Happy New Year, Elena. Enjoy your evening. She stared at the screen. The letters seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity. He never reached out. Not like this. She typed a reply, her thumbs trembling. Elena. Thank you. You too. Are you at the gala? She watched the screen. 3 gray dots appeared. They pulsed like a heartbeat. Then they vanished. The silence of the apartment felt 10 times louder in the absence of those dots. Then they reappeared. S. I am. 200 people I don't want to talk to. Wearing a tux I hate, wishing I was literally anywhere else. Elena. That sounds honest. I thought you liked the theater of it. S. The theater's for people who don't see the stagehands, Elena. What are you doing? Parties? Friends? She looked at her wine, at the penguins, on her knees, at the blue light reflecting off the dust in the air. She could lie. She could say she was at a rooftop bar in Manhattan, drinking champagne with people who mattered. Elena. Just a quiet night. I've seen this movie 12 times. The radiator's yelling at me. It's significantly less glamorous than a gala. S. I suspect your radiator has better conversation than the woman currently trying to sell me on her daughter's doll collection. 700 of them, all with names. Elena let out a short, startled laugh. The sound was alien in the room. Elena. 700. That's not a collection, S. That's an army. Be careful, S. I'm always careful. But tonight, it feels like the walls are closing in. I'd trade the champagne for your mediocre movie in a heartbeat. She didn't reply. She couldn't. The subtext was a live wire between them. He was a man with a target on his back, and she was a woman with a void in her chest, and for a few seconds, they were the only 2 people in the city. As 11 p.m. approached, the tension in the air outside began to mirror the tension in the phone. Elena could hear the distant, muffled cheers of the city beginning its countdown. But in the shadows of the Rizzo building, the paranoia was reaching its peak. Salvatore stood on the balcony of the gala, the cold wind whipping his hair. He wasn't looking at the fireworks being prepared over the harbor. He was looking at the black cars idling in the street below. He saw the way Moretti's men were positioning themselves. He realized then that he wasn't just tired of the game, he was done with it. He looked at his phone, the screen reflecting the deep dark bags under his eyes. He had spent 20 years being the king, and all it had earned him was a life where he couldn't even tell his secretary she was the only thing that made the oxygen worth breathing. The code of silence was a prison, and he was about to stage a jailbreak. This story is about to take a dark turn. What time is it where you are watching this from? Are you alone in the dark, or is someone watching your back? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more untold stories of the underworld's hidden heart and the legends of the shadows, subscribe to Noir Episodes now. The secret is safe with us. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a masterclass in atmospheric deception. Under the towering crystal chandeliers, the air tasted of expensive ozone, vintage lilies, and the underlying metallic bite of hidden weapons. To a casual observer, it was the pinnacle of New York high society. To Salvator Rizzo, it was a shark tank where the water was beginning to churn. The doll collector, a woman named Beatrice with eyes as sharp and cold as diamond chips, leaned in close to Salvatore. She was draped in sequins that caught the light like scales. She was a cousin to the Morettis, a whisperer who specialized in the social engineering of betrayal. "You seem distracted, Salvatore," she purred, her glass of champagne sweating against her manicured palm. "It's New Year's Eve. The world is at your feet, yet you look like a man who's already halfway out the door." Salvatore didn't look at her. He flicked his wrist, the platinum face of his watch catching the glare. 11:32 p.m. "I've always preferred the exit to the entrance, Beatrice," Salvatore replied. He looked across the room. Vinnie Moretti was standing near the buffet, laughing too loudly, his eyes darting toward the grand staircase every 30 seconds. The trap was calibrated with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Moretti didn't just want Salvatore dead, he wanted him humiliated. He knew that Salvatore had been distant. He'd seen the way the king checked his phone when he thought no one was looking. He had scouts stationed at the mouth of the Queen's Midtown Tunnel and a cleaner crew idling in a nondescript van near Astoria. They were waiting for the black Cadillac to break the perimeter of the Manhattan safe zone. Salvatore felt a sharp tug on his elbow. He turned to find his sister, Gianna, pulling him toward the shadow of a marble pillar. Gianna was the only one who saw the man behind the myth. She saw the way his jaw was set, not in anger, but in a desperate, quiet resolve. "Sal, don't," she whispered, her voice trembling beneath the roar of the big band, playing a swing version of Auld Lang Syne. "Don't what, Gianna?" "I saw the texts. I saw the look on your face when you replied to her. You're going to her, aren't you? To the secretary. To the ghost in the office." Salvatore's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "Her name is Elena, and she's not a ghost. She's the only thing in the city that isn't haunted." "Vinny is watching you like a hawk, Sal. The commission. They're looking for any excuse to say you've lost your edge. You leave this gala now, unprotected, to go to a walk-up in Queens for a girl who doesn't even know who you really are? They'll kill you for this. They'll make an example of you." Salvatore reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind Gianna's ear. His hand was steady, as cold and firm as the marble behind them. "They've been trying to kill me since I was 19, Gianna. But I've spent the last 20 years surrounded by people who would sell my soul for a higher percentage of the waste management tax. I'm tired of the perfume. I'm tired of the lies." "It's suicide," she hissed. "Stay. Toast the new year. Be the king for one more night." Salvatore adjusted his cuffs, his gaze drifting to the door where Rocco was already signaling that the car was in position. "I've been the king for a long time, Gianna," he said, his voice dropping to a low, noir, thick rumble. "And I've found that the view from the throne is remarkably lonely. If they're going to take my life tonight, then I'll die with a better view than this room. I'll die looking at someone who sees me, not the title. Just me." Sal, go back to the table, Gianna. Drink the mediocre champagne. Tell them I had a headache. Tell them whatever you want. I'm going home." He turned and walked away, his tuxedo coattails snapping behind him like the wings of a crow. He didn't look back at the doll collector. He didn't look at Vinnie Moretti. He walked straight through the heavy oak doors and into the freezing night where the trap was already being sprung. As the Cadillac screeched away from the pier, 3 blocks over, a radio crackled to life. "The Eagle is flying," a voice whispered into a headset. "He's heading for the tunnel, unaccompanied by the usual detail, just him and the driver." In the back of a van parked in the shadows of a warehouse in Long Island City, a man checked the action on an Uzi. "Copy that. Let him get across the bridge. We want him in the narrow streets, nowhere to run." The setup was perfect. The city was distracted by the fireworks. The noise of the celebrations would drown out the sound of the lead. But as Salvator Rizzo stared at the rain-streaked window of his car, he wasn't thinking about the men in the van. He was thinking about the smell of Elena's office, the scent of vanilla and paper. He was walking into a massacre, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive. The clock on Elena's microwave hummed with a low-voltage buzz, the green numbers flickering as they marched toward the end of the world. 11:50 p.m. The rom-com on the television was muted now, the silent flickers of a cinematic kiss washing the room in shades of artificial blue. Elena sat motionless, her fingers curled into the soft fleece of her penguin pajamas. The wine was gone. The radiator had stopped its rhythmic gnashing, leaving the apartment in a state of crystalline, terrifying silence. Then the sound came. A sharp, electric rattle, the buzzer. It was a violent intrusion in the quiet of her sanctuary. Elena's heart didn't just race, it slammed against her. Ribs like a bird in a cage. Her brain, clouded by the wine and the isolation, struggled to process the impossibility of the sound. Nobody buzzed 4B, not at midnight. She stood, her legs feeling like lead. She walked toward the intercom, her bare feet silent on the cold linoleum of the kitchen. She pressed the button, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. "Hello?" "Elena, it's Salvatore. Can I come up?" The world tilted. The name was a shock to her system, a collision of her secret fantasies and the harsh reality of her employer. She didn't ask how. She didn't ask why. Her finger moved of its own accord, pressing the release. The thrum of the door lock downstairs echoed through the floorboards. She had 60 seconds. She caught her reflection in the darkened window. She looked pathetic. The messy bun, the mascara smudges, the ridiculous penguins. She tried to smooth her hair, but her hands were shaking too hard. She stood in the center of her small living room, the air suddenly feeling heavy, charged with the static of his proximity. 3 knocks, steady, controlled. Elena opened the door. Salvator Rizzo stood in the dim yellow light of the hallway. He looked like an apparition from a more dangerous world. His tuxedo was damp with sleet, the dark wool absorbing the light. His bow tie was undone, hanging like a broken noose around his neck. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were burning with a terrifying, focused intensity. "S," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer with words. He stepped into the apartment, his presence immediately shrinking the space. He smelled of cold rain, expensive tobacco, and a sharp metallic scent she couldn't identify. He looked at her, at the pajamas, the wine glass, the dying succulent. "I couldn't stay there," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "I spent 3 hours thinking about this room, about you." He moved closer. The energy radiating off him was physical, a heat that pushed back the chill of the apartment. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray tear on her cheek. "Can I kiss you, Elena?" 11:59 p.m. Outside, the city began to scream, the distant roar of a million voices counting down the final seconds of the year. "Yes," she breathed. He pulled her in. His hands were large, certain, and unexpectedly warm. As his lips met hers, the world outside vanished. It was a kiss of desperate honesty, of 2 years of silence finally breaking. In the middle of the kiss, the atmosphere shifted. Salvator didn't pull away, but Elena felt his muscles lock into iron. Over Salvator's shoulder, on the beige wallpaper next to Steve the succulent, a tiny, vibrant red dot appeared. It danced with a sickening fluidity. It wasn't a glitch in the TV. It was a laser sight. The dot moved from the wall to the back of Salvator's head. He knew it was there. He had known the moment he stepped onto the sidewalk that he was the bait. He wasn't just here to confess his love. He had led the wolves to his door so he could slaughter them in the dark. He shifted his weight, subtly moving his body to perfectly obscure Elena, turning himself into a human shield of silk and Kevlar. "Stay down," he murmured against her lips, his voice devoid of fear. The window didn't just break, it disintegrated. A muffled thwip crack, the unmistakable sound of a high-velocity round passing through a suppressor, shattered the glass. The air in the room was suddenly filled with a glittering cloud of crystalline shards. Elena screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the New Year's fireworks exploding over the East River. Salvator didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover. With a fluid, predatory grace, he reached behind his back, pulling a matte black beretta from the small of his spine. He kicked her coffee table over with a violent thud, creating a barricade of splintered wood. "Under the table, now!" Another round hissed through the air, punching a hole through her sofa, sending a spray of white stuffing into the air like macabre snow. Salvator leveled his weapon at the window. He didn't fire wildly. He breathed. He timed his shot with the boom of a massive firework outside. Bang! The muzzle flash lit the room in a strobe light of violence. The smell of gunpowder, sulphurous, hot, and biting, flooded the small living room, instantly overriding the scent of her wine. Elena was on the floor, her hands over her head. She looked down at her penguin pajamas. They were covered in tiny, jagged diamonds of window glass. One large shard was embedded in the fleece of her knee, glinting under the blue light of the TV. She looked for blood. There was none, only the smell of burnt cordite and the sound of Salvator's heavy, rhythmic breathing as he stood over her, a dark god in a tuxedo, holding the line between her and the abyss. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Salvator didn't look back. He stared out into the New York night, his eyes reflecting the distant gold and red of the fireworks. "No," he said, his voice cold as the ice outside. "It's just beginning. If you were in his shoes and your brothers tried to take your life in the one place you felt safe, would you show mercy or would you burn the city down to find them? Comment justice or vengeance below." The ringing in Elena's ears was a high, thin whine, a sharp contrast to the thunderous celebration still booming outside the shattered window. The smell of the room had changed irrevocably. The scent of vanilla and cheap wine had been scorched away, replaced by the heavy metallic tang of cordite and the cold, wet breath of the winter air rushing through the jagged hole in the glass. Salvator didn't move for a heartbeat. He stood like a silhouette of justice against the backdrop of the flickering New York sky. Then, he moved. He didn't go to Elena. Not yet. He stepped toward the window, his movements feline and lethal. Below, on the fire escape, there was a wet, sliding sound, a groan. Salvator reached out, his hand wrapping around the collar of a dark tactical jacket, and hauled a man through the broken frame. The hitman tumbled onto Elena's hardwood floor, his weapon skittering away under the radiator. He was clutching his shoulder, blood, dark and viscous in the blue TV light, seeping through his fingers. He was young, barely 20, with a face that looked more suited for a college library than a contract killing. Salvator stood over him, the muzzle of the beretta pressed firmly into the hollow of the boy's throat. Elena crawled out from beneath the coffee table. Her hands were buried in the fleece of her penguin pajamas, her knuckles white. She looked at the boy on the floor, then at Salvator. She had seen Salvator Rizzo the boss for 2 years, but she had never seen Salvator Rizzo the executioner. The silence in the room was a living thing. "Who sent you?" Salvator's voice was lower than a whisper, vibrating with a frequency that made the remaining glass in the window frame rattle. "Was it Moretti? Did he tell you I was soft? Did he tell you I wouldn't be ready?" The hitman choked, his eyes wide and glazed with terror. I was just told, the apartment, the girl..." Salvator's finger tightened on the trigger. The hammer of the Beretta moved back with a mechanical final click. "Sal, stop." Elena's voice was small, but in the wreckage of the room, it hit him like a physical blow. Salvator's eyes flicked to her. He was at a crossroads. To pull the trigger was to protect his empire, to maintain the mask of the cold-blooded king who allowed no slights. To let him live was to expose his heart, to show the world that Elena Morrison was his anchor and therefore his greatest liability. He looked back at the boy. The Mafia King wanted the floor stained red, but the man who had just kissed Elena felt the weight of her gaze. With a snarl of disgust, Salvator lowered the weapon. He brought his foot down, hard on the boy's wounded shoulder, drawing a strangled scream of agony. "You're going to run," Salvator said, his voice cold as the sleet. "You're going to go back to Moretti. You're going to tell him that he missed, and then you're going to tell him that for every drop of glass he broke in this room, I am going to take a year of his life. Now get out before I change my mind." The boy scrambled toward the door, leaving a smear of red on the floorboards. He didn't look back. The door slammed shut. The adrenaline crash hit the room like a tidal wave. Salvator turned toward Elena. The Beretta disappeared back into his holster, and the terrifying icy mask dissolved. He looked old. He looked human. He walked toward her, his shoes crunching on the glass shards. He reached out, his hands hovering near her shoulders, afraid to touch her, afraid his world had already broken her. "I'm sorry," he rasped. His breathing was heavy, his chest heaving under the tuxedo shirt. I thought I could keep the two worlds apart. I thought I could come here and just be a man, but I brought the fire to your door." Elena didn't pull away. She stepped into his space, her small hands grabbing the lapels of his damp jacket. She could feel the frantic drumming of his heart against her palms. "Why, Salvator?" she whispered, her voice thick with the remnants of her terror. "Why me? I'm the girl who manages your calendar. I'm the girl who talks to plants. Why would you risk everything, your life, your position, to be here at midnight?" He looked down at her, his eyes searching hers with a raw, desperate honesty. "Because I've spent 41 years being what everyone else needed me to be," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been a son, a soldier, a boss. But when I'm with you, in this shitty apartment, looking at those ridiculous pajamas, I'm just Sal. You're the only person who doesn't want something from me. You're the only person who sees in me." He pulled her against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "I love you, Elena. I've loved you since the day you told me I was wasting my time in that meeting. I didn't come here to start a war. I came here because I couldn't imagine starting another year without you knowing the truth." Outside, the last of the fireworks faded, leaving the city in a hazy, smoke-filled dawn. Inside, amidst the shattered glass and the smell of gunpowder, the king had surrendered. If you were in his shoes and your brother tried to kill you in the one place you felt safe, would you let the hitman live to send a message, or would you end it right there? Comment yes or no below. The transition from the shattered silence of a Queen's walk-up to the ancestral weight of a Brooklyn brownstone was more than a change of scenery. It was a baptism. For Elena, the world of beige carpets and filing cabinets was dead, buried under the glass shards of her living room floor. In its place was a world of red sauce, ancient grudges, and the terrifying, beautiful gravity of the Rizzo bloodline. 3 days after the ball dropped, the air in Lucia's kitchen didn't smell like the new year. It smelled of slow-simmered garlic, rosemary, and the cold, metallic scent of impending violence. This was not a celebratory meal. It was a mobilization. Salvator sat at the head of the long oak table, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the tension in his forearms. Around him sat the lieutenants of his inner circle, men with names like Paolo and Rocco, and his father, Senior, whose eyes were like 2 pieces of flint. "The hitman talked," Salvator said, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum that commanded the room. "Moretti didn't just break a truce. He tried to break my house. He thinks because I've been quiet, I've grown soft. He thinks a skyscraper makes me a businessman." Salvator leaned forward, the light from the chandelier reflecting in the dark depths of his wine. "We don't go for Moretti first. We take his legs. Paulo, the Newark waste contracts, shut them down. Every truck, every driver. If they move, they burn. Rocco, the social club in Howard Beach. I want the doors welded shut. I want his soldiers to feel the cold. The systematic dismantling began that night. It wasn't a Hollywood blitz. It was a surgical extraction of Moretti's influence. One by one, the vulture's revenue streams dried up. Missed payments led to desertions. Desertions led to whispers. By the end of the week, Vinnie Moretti wasn't a rival. He was a man drowning in a desert. While the men mapped out the geography of the vendetta, Elena was undergoing her own transformation in the upper rooms of the house. She stood at the end of a long linen table, facing Nonna Rosa. The 92-year-old matriarch moved with a deceptive fragility, her hands gnarled like the roots of an old olive tree. Between them lay a massive, high-thread count fitted sheet. "You hold the ED corner, Piccola," Nonna commanded, her voice a sharp rasp. "You don't let it bunch. A messy bed is a messy mind. In this family, we keep the edges tight." Elena followed the movements, her fingers learning the intricate rhythmic dance of the fold. It wasn't just about laundry. As they worked, Nonna spoke in the code, the oral history of the Rizzo women. She told Elena about the winters of '72, about how to tell when a man was lying by the way he held his fork, and how to stay silent when the police were at the door. "You are not the girl who types the letters anymore," Nonna said, her sharp eyes pinning Elena to the spot. "You are the one who keeps the king's pulse. When he is cold, you are the fire. When he is loud, you are the silence. Do you understand the weight of this?" Elena looked at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. "I understand, Nonna." She wasn't just a secretary. She was becoming the consigliere's heart, the moral and emotional anchor for a man who spent his days in the dark. She was the one who would remind him why the war was worth winning. The final act of retribution came on a Tuesday. Vinnie Moretti was hiding in a basement apartment in Gravesend, jumping at the sound of every passing car. A knock came at his door, not the heavy boot of a hitman, but a polite, soft rap. On his doorstep sat a wooden crate. Inside, nestled in expensive straw, was a single bottle of the mediocre champagne from the New Year's gala, the exact bottle Salvatore had complained about. The cork had been removed and replaced with a small, hand-calligraphed card. There was no signature, only 3 words written in Salvatore's elegant, precise hand. "Taste the silence." Beneath the bottle lay a single dried leaf from Steve the succulent, a reminder that Salvatore knew exactly what had been lost and exactly what he was willing to do to protect what remained. Moretti didn't drink the champagne. He left the city that night, a broken man with no empire, haunted by the knowledge that the king wasn't soft. He was simply waiting for a reason to be cruel. As the sun set over the Brooklyn Bridge, Salvatore and Elena stood on the balcony of the brownstone. The war wasn't over. In their world, it never truly was, but the lines had been redrawn. "You're colder now," Elena whispered, her hand sliding into his. Salvatore looked out at the city, the lights of Manhattan glittering like a carpet of fallen stars. "The world changed at midnight, Elena. I'm not just protecting a throne anymore. I'm protecting a home. The history of the New York underworld is written in blood, but its legends are forged in the quiet moments that the newspapers never see." Decades would pass since that sleet-drenched night in 1994, and the name Rizzo would become synonymous with a new kind of power, not one built on the hollow foundation of fear, but on the unbreakable steel of a singular private devotion. As the years rolled on, the city transformed. The soot-stained tenements of Queens were replaced by glass towers, and the old social clubs of Brooklyn became high-end boutiques. Most of the men who stood in that Pierre Hotel ballroom on New Year's Eve were gone, lost to the life, to the stone walls of federal penitentiaries, or to the quiet, dusty corners of history. Vinnie Moretti became a cautionary tale, a ghost story whispered to young soldiers about what happens when you mistake a lion's peace for a lion's sleep. But the legacy of Salvatore and Elena Rizzo remained. They say that after that night, the Rizzo organization became a fortress. It wasn't because Salvatore became more brutal, though he was more efficient than ever, but because he finally had a reason to ensure the foundation was solid. The consigliere's heart had done her work well. Elena didn't just manage his schedule, she managed his soul. She was the steady hand that stayed his blade when anger threatened his logic, and the fire that warmed him when the cold weight of the crown became too much to bear. The world of noir teaches us that everyone has a price, and every light eventually flickers out. But the story of the Mafia King and the secretary offers a different truth, one more profound and far more dangerous. True power isn't measured by the number of men who bow when you enter a room. It isn't found in the ledgers of illicit millions or the territorial maps of a concrete jungle. True power is the ability to walk away from a throne and know that you aren't walking into the dark. It is having one person, one single soul, who knows the worst parts of you and chooses to stay. It is the realization that the greatest empire a man can build isn't made of brick and mortar. It's made of the quiet promises kept at midnight. The final shot of our story doesn't take place in a boardroom or a dark alley. We move to the sun-drenched balcony of a secure estate overlooking the harbor. The air is still, save for the distant rhythmic hum of the city. That never sleeps. On the stone ledge sits a ceramic pot. In it, Steve the succulent is still there, gnarled, scarred, and leaning, but he is no longer alone. Beside him, a new succulent, vibrant and thriving with thick green leaves, shares the soil. They are an odd pair, the survivor and the thriver, rooted together. Salvator stands by the railing, his hair silvered by time, his hand resting on the small of Elena's back. She's wearing a silk robe the color of a New York dawn, her hand resting over his. They don't speak. They don't need to. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long noir shadows across the water, the camera pulls back. The king and his queen are just two silhouettes against the gold, watching the city they ruled, the city they survived, and the city where they finally found a home. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of the wind and the ghost of a midnight knock. Where are you watching this story from? What is the weather like in your corner? Of the world today? If you want more untold stories of the underworld's hidden heart and the legends of the shadows, subscribe to Noir Episodes now. The secret is safe with us.